what I'd like to do during this session would be an overall thumbnail sketch of what we're doing all together for Henricus College 1619, without going into much detail on any part of it, to give a quick look. First off, the name, we always need to point that out. It is Henricus, Latin for Henry, College, spelled with a D, and the date 1619 is part of our name also on purpose, because this is America's first college, set up in 1619, which was a very interesting, significant historical year in American history, which is a separate teaching all by itself. So much happened that year, including founding the college. But that gave us a platform for talking about everything else, because what we're saying is based on primary source material that we recovered and that nobody else had looked at for 70 or 80 years, and they didn't even know that it existed anymore, and we didn't either, just stumbled across it basically. And as we started going through the primary source material, which is the words of those who were there on both sides of the Atlantic, talking about what they were going to do, and then talking about what they did, and then talking about what the experience was to change what they did next, and so forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's quite different conclusions are drawn from the primary source material than from most historians, which did not have access to them or didn't realize they could have had access to them. And so our conclusions are unique in the historical field about Jamestown, for instance, and Plymouth, in the city of Henricus up the river on the James River, and a bunch of other things too, come out of the primary source material. That's always highly esteemed within the field of history, to check what you're saying about they did this or did that, and what did something first and second, third, whatever. Some historians play fast and loose with that, and some histories are more like making history rather than telling it. Some of that's on purpose. I'll take a moment just to say something about Shakespeare, because he was alive during the period when the college was being formed and when the Virginia Company was set up and America was being grand founded. Some of his plays are considered historic plays or history plays. And when the historians look at them, the dates are not correct, the people are not historically accurate, what happened isn't really, and the question was, he wasn't a very good historian. Well, he wasn't trying to be a good historian. He was an entertainer, a playwright, and he wrote plays using a history theme for great satire on what was going on at the time when he was there. And the people in the audience knew who he was talking about. This character do something that was weird and kind of stupid maybe, and they knew he's really talking about so-and-so. He didn't put him by name, but all the audience knew that. We don't know it particularly, but they did. So that's a different form of history. King Henry or King somebody doing something that they never did, and they look like a buffoon, and they're really talking about King James, the current king, who would put you in a dungeon for talking like that about him. But since they're not talking about him, anyway, that's one version of history or historical presentation. And we are trying to stay as close as possible with the historical record. The Virginia Company records is the primary example of that. And there are other things that led to the Virginia Company records, but they cover the period from 1606 AD to 1624 AD, with a little thing written after it's all over with as a retrospective from the Virginia Company headquarters leaders, the ex-leaders, because the company was abolished, and they're talking about their experience over those 18 years. And so that's outside 1624, but it's part of that same set of records. So, and all this occurred directly as a result of the Great Reformation in Northern Europe. Sometimes we just say in Europe, but it's actually Northern Europe. But this is where the Protestants came from. And it was a reformation from what the Roman Catholics were doing in Southern Europe. And they didn't like each other. There were several sets of military engagements and wars, and butcheries, and all kinds of stuff going on between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. But we came out of the Reformation people. We, the United States of America and American civilization, came out of that set of thinking. So we have made a point of looking at, well, what were they thinking? What was their worldview? What's their thought style? And it is distinct, and it still is distinct, and it explains a whole lot about how come America is the way it is, or the way it was set up to be. So me primarily at this point, I was trying to find some way to counter the stories that were being given at Jamestown where I was working, which were not historically accurate, and they were agenda-driven. And what I was saying countered that, and the people that promoted their vision didn't like what I was saying at all. And they jumped on me about making stuff up and this and that and the other. So I backed up and took another good look at the records. And then, well, what I'm saying about what they said about themselves is that's my recollection of that's correct. And therefore, we need to change our whole interpretive thing there at Jamestown to match what they said about themselves. That would have been our job to do. I found out that I stepped on some toes doing that. But we've stayed with it, and to withstand the criticisms that I was just making stuff up or substituting a different version that I wish they'd have been like instead of the one that we were presenting, I needed a platform, something that would withstand all kinds of criticisms, assaults and attacks and everything else. And that's where we came up with Henricus College 1619, because it really was there as an organization, and it had a campus designated, but it never really had the buildings. To build a campus and set up a college in a foreign country across the ocean is a big deal. That's bigger than trying to do it at home and you're somewhere in your own neighborhood. So it took them years and years and years to get this thing cranked up. But it was officially recognized in the record of the Virginia General Assembly. So that gave the college existence credibility, because they said there's no such thing as a college on the James River before the Pilgrims came over here to found America in 1620. I said, yes, there was. And well, where are you getting that from? Well, right out of the records of the Virginia General Assembly, which are also kept in the Virginia Company records. The General Assembly keeps its own records too, and they're very proud of their long history. So we just point out, well, here's where they met, here's what they said on the first business day, and one of those things was to found the college and where it was going to be, upriver. And so we chose that as a platform, brought that back into existence, revived it, as we call it. It's America's first college, revived. And we have chosen to keep the spelling of the name or the word college with the D in it on purpose, because that looks a little different, and it is different. What they did with a college is not what we do with a college today. They didn't have football teams and sports and all that kind of stuff. Today's college is not the same thing as it was then. Well, we wanted to talk about them because that's the way they set up America, and they set the college up and to do the teaching for the way they set up the rest of it. So that turned out to be an interesting venture all by itself. And sometime or another I will describe what it took to go through the Commission of Higher Education and a bunch of other people in order to get that college set up and recognized and named officially. It exists, and it still does. And that was 30 years ago as I'm speaking right now. And we had to feel our way through that too. But that was our platform, Henricus College 1619. Who was Henricus? Before I leave that, let me point this out. King James, of the King James Version of the Bible, was the King of England, came in 1603, and a couple years later authorized the translation of the Bible into what we now call the King James Version. And I've spoken with groups from England who came to visit Jamestown and mentioned that, and they said, well, what's the King James Version? They didn't know that. I said, well, to myself, how can they not know what the King James Version was? Well, they call it the Authorized Version. That's the official name of that Bible. And we shorthand refer to it as the King James Version. Officially, you can say it's the Authorized Version. Well, anyway, Jamestown is named after him, and he was the king. And he had 3 children, a daughter, Elizabeth, who married into the Protestant family in what became the House of Orange and in Holland. And they were at the center of a number of Roman Catholic attacks on the Netherlands or the Low Countries to make them Roman Catholic again. And they fought him back and said, no, we're Protestant, we believe the Bible's true, and they were part of that. And King James's daughter was over there as part of that. And then he had another child. The first one was a son, born in Scotland. And then he had a second son, also born in Scotland. The first one was named Henry, the second one was named Charles. So Henry is where we get Henricus from. So this college was named in his honor at the time. Cape Henry down at Virginia Beach is named in his honor. The other cape across the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay is Cape Charles. And then the Elizabeth River is right around the bend there where the Norfolk Navy base is. And then the James River, of course, goes all the way up into the Blue Ridge, other side of the Blue Ridge, actually. So that's the main river in Virginia, too. So that's where we get the name from, named after Henry. Henrico County around Richmond. Used to be all the way around Richmond, and then they got enough people on one side and the other. It was enough for 2 counties, so they split it. And the northern part of around Richmond is Henrico County. The southern part is now Chesterfield County. But at this time, it was all considered part of the city of Henricus, actually, which has been rebuilt. That city was built originally in 1611 to be the capital of Virginia. So there's all sorts of stuff that challenges, in that case, challenges the preeminence of Jamestown. And I'll just say this in passing. The standard story is that John Smith led these people over here from England to establish Jamestown. According to the record, they came to establish settlements along this river and were instructed to go 100 miles upriver and establish their principal seat. That turns out to be the fall line at Richmond. The falls, by the way, is more like rapids. It's 7 miles, big rocks standing upright in the river with water coming around both sides of them, and it goes for 7 miles down, and it's white water when it's really full of water too, and it's really rough there. But they did not come to establish Jamestown. There wasn't any such thing as Jamestown. They didn't know anything about that, and John Smith didn't lead them either. I don't want to build too much emphasis on this point, except to say that John Smith was not the leader. Christopher Newport was selected to be the leader of the 3 ships that came over here. And he's the one that led them over, led them up to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, led them up the James River all the way to the fall line and put a cross up at the falls up there. Well, what about John Smith? He was involved in a mutiny on the way over. He either knew about it and didn't report it, which is a capital offense by itself, or he participated in, or he set it up and started it. There could be some productive scholarship on that point someday. At any rate, he was put under arrest, and the reason they didn't put him on trial and probably execute him on board the ship was that he was under the authority of King James, who said, sent him over to the crew just before they left, a couple of weeks before, said, add this man to your crew. What are you going to do? And the king says that, right? So they put him in the crew. And that meant they didn't know exactly what his relationship was with the king, but he had a letter from him anyway. So you got to put your hands off, kid gloves type thing. So they just put him in the brig for the rest of the trip over. And if he did indeed go all the way up to the fall line, 100 miles, he was still in the brig when he was doing that. And they opened the council, the instruction, here's who to be on your council when you start, or some of them anyway. And King James group said, here's who they are, and then you can elect the rest of them. Should be 13 people total on that council. And John Smith's name was on the council. And here he is in the brig for mutiny with a death penalty trial, maybe hanging over him. And here he is listening. He's going to be one of the leaders. Well, they didn't let him out of the brig. And he got really mad about that. Really mad. Never forgave him for that. And eventually this one died and that one died. And they didn't have enough people so they let him out of the brig. Never did try him for the mutiny. And then there's almost nobody left on that list to be on the council, so they made him the president. And they elected him as president, and the leader was an elected position. This was radical at the time, too, because King James didn't like that elected leadership stuff. That's like a republic. And he heard that they were trying to do away with monarchy anyway, so you better not let them just stop them. And they say that's apparently what some of John Smith's instructions were, to prevent this from turning into a republic. Anyway, we've got a statue of Smith down at Jamestown. It says governor, and it lists a couple of years there. But he was never governor. That's one of the errors. That's a simple one. That is so simple to check. They did not use the term governor while he was even here in Virginia, here in the continent of Virginia. He was president, and I've threatened for years to go out there at night with a chisel and just ding, 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 tip that word governor off of there. And I never did that. Just in case somebody does, it wasn't me. But that's one of the types of errors that we're looking at. And so we point out in the record, that's not what it's, that our statue down there is not correct. It's historically incorrect. So we need to correct it. No, they didn't want to correct it. They wanted to keep him there. So, and then tell me to quit talking about it. So I set the college up, and we kept that name. Henry, it's Henricus. Some people say Henricus. I think they would have said Henricus. That would be more accurate with the Latin pronunciation of it. And college with the D in it, because that's the way they spelled college at that time. And 1619 in our name, too. That's on purpose. That makes us stand out as unique among all the colleges in America, all the rest of them. And there's a relationship between Henricus and a couple of the later colleges, too, which I'll talk about at some point. But right now, that's just an introduction to the name and where it came from and some of the things that were involved in getting this set up to begin with in 1619. And so 30 years ago, after several years of work on how in the world do you revive America's first college, people say you can't do that. Nobody's ever done that before. There's no way to do it. And I'll just say this about the Commission of Higher Education in Virginia, which has authority over all the colleges, all of them, and to set the rules that they must meet in order to qualify for the name college. And so I went up to see him, and he pulled out this book about that thick and started flipping through. Here's what you need to do if you want to start this college. You need so many 100,000 feet in your campus buildings. You need so many thousand volumes in your library. You need so many dozens of PhDs on your faculty. And you put that all together and some other stuff, you're talking about almost $1 million to get a college started. And that, of course, I didn't have any money at all, and I didn't want to do what he's talking about. I didn't even want a campus. They didn't have a campus. We're not going to have a campus. They didn't have PhDs on faculty. They didn't even have that title in those days. And the basic thrust of their educational system was you would go to college or go to the university until you learned enough and then you left and went on about your life. And I've had people just turn pale at that thought. Well, how would I know when I've learned enough? Well, another question is, if you don't know, who is is somebody that doesn't even know you, and say, okay, you can go this long, and at that point you got to get out of here. We'll give you a degree and go away and do something with your life. And we decreed that you can do it this long and do these things, and then you get the degree. Well, they didn't do the degree stuff back then, so we're not either. And we've told them that we don't want a college that starts a degree or has degrees. So one of the questions, I went to see this commission people 3 or 4 times during over a year period, and toward the end of that, I mentioned again that Henricus College was a ministry, a teaching ministry. It came out of the Reformation. And let me say this about that. The Reformation idea of how you convert people to believing in Jesus Christ is you teach them the Bible first, before you're ever asked to commit to believing in Him or anything. You teach them the Bible, teach them, to get them in the Word, get the Word in them, and at some point the belief was that the Word will interact with their spirit and they will come to believe, and then they will want to express that and confess that, tell people about it, act in a way that everybody knows that they are now a believer. Now, boy, that's different than the way we do ministerial work. They come down front and ask Jesus to come into your heart. These people said you can't even do that, that God decides who He's going to select, and it's going to be a gift from Him, and it's not something that we can start or stop. If He chooses you, you're chosen. If He doesn't choose you, you can do whatever you want to, and it's not going to make any difference. That He may choose you later and may have already chosen you for a certain period. That's a whole different kind of a thing than we have today. So we're talking today with today's culture about all that, about things that were originally in America that are not quite the same as the way we do them today. So just keep that in mind. That's what you know when you hear the word college. Keep that knowledge, put it up on the shelf. Don't lose it, just keep it. What you know about republic or democracy, keep that on the shelf, put that in there too. What you know about Christianity, keep that on the shelf. And let's just open up and let's see, what did they actually say? And we have what they actually said now. The Virginia Company records are over 3,000 pages of primary source material. That's a lot of stuff to read, and it's been reduced down and extracted certain things, and that's what we've done too, because not all of it is equally important to what we're trying to focus on. So anyway, there is a tremendous set of material out available now. It's been published, put in modern day English, sold to universities all over the United States and in England too. And the historical living history museums have been very reluctant to pick this up. I think that's just fascinating to me. It's kind of disturbing, but they resisted having the historical records there on Jamestown Island in the bookstore. They still don't sell them in the bookstore. They don't even tell you about them in the historical interpretation either. And the city of Henricus has them in their bookstore now. The state Jamestown has it in their bookstore, but they put a binder of twine around it and around this way and around this way, and they've had the books up there for sale, but you can't open it up to see if that's something maybe you want. And it's like, they really don't want that information out, but they almost had to because it's real stuff. So, and the people at Plymouth don't like any of this at all, of anything before 1620. So they don't have it up there either. Well, this is my natural place where I come from and speak to, and that's from the Living History Museum. So that goes throughout the Henricus College thing, what we're challenging, who needs to correct stuff. It is all the historians since the Civil War, almost all of them are in error on some of these major issues. But our main focus is a challenge to the living history museums. And we express it this way. If you don't have the primary source material as the basis for your interpretive schema, then does that make you a history-themed amusement park? And in some cases, that's probably a fair assessment. People come there and have a good time, and then they go home, and it didn't make any difference in their life. They had a day out from school or a day away from work or something. Another option is to substitute, and this has been done too, the humanist point of view about life and mankind and the whole thing. There is no creator to start with, so there's no redeemer either. And forget all that kind of talk at Jamestown, because we don't even recognize that kind of stuff. So it's an agenda-driven propaganda pit. That's my description for that. Or are you actually an historically accurate living history museum? You can be. The material is there. We've got it. Other people got it. It's all over America, like I said, in libraries. It's available to you, and that's our challenge. So while we're at it, we're speaking to everybody else in America too, because not everybody goes to these living history museums. It's that they are particular things, and they're set up by tax money, and they're telling stuff that's not accurate, and they need to get it accurate. So, but we're speaking to everybody, actually, to school teachers, so on. So, let me mention the connection between Henricus College and Harvard and William and Mary. Those two schools argue back and forth all the time about who's first and who's second. And that's a little separate. Nobody else much cares except them, but they do argue with each other. And my point is, no. Harvard was 1636. Now, which came first, 1619 or 1636? Well, that means they're not the first college. Henricus is the first college. And William and Mary is 1693. So how does William and Mary claim to be earlier than Harvard? Well, they claim their roots at Henricus. They didn't have much information on it, but they knew there was an effort to set a college up, and they claimed to be that same school that finally put in place in a campus and so on, moved downriver from Henricus to Williamsburg, where it is now. But they still say they're first in their antecedents at Henricus. They've got a big plaque at the William and Mary well-known Wren building, most historic building on campus, big marble plaque that talks about the priorities of the College of William and Mary. And one of them is its antecedent college at Henricus in 1619. So what do we do about Harvard? Well, the guy who was selected to be the first director of Henricus in 1619 by title was rector. The education is considered to be under the church, not the state. That's another difference between now and then, but it's a very recent thing to put education under the government, the state. At this time, it was clearly under the church, and so the title of the leader of the educational system was a rector, R-E-C-T-O-R, and his name was Patrick Copeland, and he was on the way being sent to come over to Henricus to be the rector. They had the Great Indian Massacre of 1622, which stopped construction, ran everybody off the campus for a year, and stopped him from coming over here. He ended up coming to Bermuda, and he set up the public school system in Bermuda, which they still have there. Then he went on down to the Bahamas, and he became involved in a ministry to the ships that came through, which were, they all stopped in the Bahamas, all kinds of Protestant ships. And during this period, the Virginia Company had been squashed, and it became a royal colony. The northern part of Virginia was then beginning to be called New England, and they wanted some people up there, and they wanted a school up there too. And this man named John Harvard had a big library and a big interest in the school, so he donated his library to start the school called Harvard after him. And when they were building that, they needed wood that would last in the climate and would not have termites and wouldn't rot and so on. So they contacted Patrick Copeland down in the Bahamas and said, could you arrange for us to have some wood, some tropical wood, teak likely? And he said, yes. And he said, well, how can we pay you for that? He said, well, what we need mostly is not money, we need food. So they sent a whole bunch of food from New England down to the Bahamas, and he sent a whole bunch of teak up to build Harvard Square. And this is on my bucket list. Someday I'm going to go to Harvard, and I'm going to that original building, which is still there somewhere in the middle of the campus, and put my hand on that wood that the first rector of Henricus College sent up there for that school. So they weren't fighting among themselves like we did later on with the Civil War. We kind of end up hating each other. Still do have some of that around. But at this point, no, they were trying to establish a Christian Commonwealth over here in North America, and that was part of it. And it was the same idea: teach people the Bible first, and the Bible will speak to them and bring their spirit into contact with Him, and then you can confirm that yes, that their baptism was a confirmation that they were believers. That's not what made you a believer. So Harvard and William and Mary are the same thrust educationally, and both of them have a connection with Henricus, which I love. That gives me the right to talk about either one of them. And all the other schools too during those days were also Christian schools. They had the same basic worldview too. And so we've chosen to connect with those sets of information about who did what and why, and particularly the why. That's not very well understood today. So what I want to take a minute right now to do is talk about the worldview, and it's called providential. Today's dominant worldview in Christianity in America is evangelical, and it's about the particular personal relationship between you and Jesus. That's the core of the evangelical. Well, providential has that core, but they also have godly state and a godly family too. So they had all three institutions, not just one. And so I want to describe a little bit to all of us, and then I have written this out as a description in two different forms. One is on a business card size, just a little business card, and I put the Bible verses for the family that they utilize, which is one man, one woman, and children in a household. And that came in Eden, or in Genesis. When they got thrown out of there, then they lived in the world, and they needed government. Didn't need it before that. So the Old Testament is full of examples of how you should have governance and how you should not have it, what blessings you get if you do it God's way, and what troubles you have if you don't, and how He sent people to warn them, warn them, warn them, warn them. That's what the prophets spend a lot of time saying. God says, don't do the way you're doing it, and He says, do it this way, and they said, get out of here, prophet. So they got busted more than once for that. Anyway, the state is creator-based according to their thinking. So first you had the family. They got booted out of Eden. The family came with them. They didn't lose that. But then now they had to build a state. And the attempt was to get a godly state, or a Christian state would be another way of saying that. But it's creator-based. No salvation in the state at all. That's how you live here. What happens when, for instance, somebody borrows a tool from somebody else, and they give it to them. And after they finish using it, then they sell it to somebody else, and it's gone, or it breaks or something. And after a while, the guy would like his tool back. He said, no, you gave it to me. He said, no, I gave it to you, like handed it to you, but I loaned it to you, and you agreed that this was a loan. I was giving you a loan of this tool. He said, no, you just said, here, I'm giving this to you. So I figured it was mine, and it's gone now. I can't give it back to you. It's either broken or sold or something. So what are you going to do? You got a dispute. Well, then you have to pay for it. You know what? So what do? Well, that's what the system of justice is about. The key feature in godly government is how you take God's word and how you resolve disputes like that. And you have a separate set of people that deal with those disputes. That's what the court system is. And then all kinds of other things. It's got nobody's going to heaven or nobody's being denied heaven, regardless of how those kind of arguments turn out. But it's how you live while you're here, that there's got to be some way to resolve these kinds of things. People do have arguments and things. Sometimes it's really serious, warlike arguments. Other times it's just a spat or something. Right behind that responsibility, the first one being of a godly state, is a system of justice. That's the core feature for any governance. Right behind that is a system of defense. This is the one we talk about today like is the primary thing for governments. And the people that built this country and designed it and planted it said, no, that's secondary. Because everywhere you live, you got a need for justice, everywhere. But you don't always have somebody going to attack you. So the most important thing to set up is a system of justice, but people do attack. So you need a system of defense too. And so that's another piece of it. And all the questions about how you pay for the people that do the system of justice, how do you pay for the people that do the system of defense, the military people, how do you pay for that? How do you collect the money? Somebody has to do all that. So they set up a system of finance too. And they have a system of welfare, which would be, we use the word welfare today, not the way they use welfare. They meant stuff like roads that everybody can ride on or walk on, and other things that are for the welfare to make life possible to work. And so that not every road is owned by somebody and can charge you. You can't walk across this property because you pay me a fee. Well, that got a little bit out of hand. So they said, we just make all the roads open. That's a welfare kind of decision. And that's the state is supposed to do that. And then here comes the New Testament time. Jesus was born finally, and they were prophesying he's coming someday. Someday he's coming. Here's where he's going to be born. Here's what he's going to look. Here's how you're going to know who he is. There are going to be a lot of people claiming to be him, and they're not him, but there is one that's going to be him, and here's how you know. And all kinds of stuff, like born from a virgin, born in Bethlehem, etc. And so when he actually came and fulfilled every single prophecy was right exactly, no errors at all. They weren't all fulfilled, because some of them are, and when he comes back, but to get him here in the first place, this is him. And as we know, they put him on trial, convicted him, and sentenced him to be crucified. And he was crucified, and he died. And he was in the grave came out on the third day and was resurrected. So that constitutes the church, that message. And if you believe that he was resurrected, and all the rest of it is important too, but that's the key feature, that he was the sacrifice for all of us. And that's a salvation message, and that's the church function. And if you take down their duties, it would be like preaching first, the salvation message, and teaching, preaching, teaching. The healing arts also were considered to be the part of the church. Today we've got almost all the medical stuff is under the state, and that's quite different than the way it was originally was viewed to be set up. And also the worship and music and that kind of stuff is a church function too. So you got the family, the state, and the church. And the big issue has always been, how do you get the state and the church together properly? Sometimes the state seems like it tells what kind of church they're going to have in their country. Other times the church tells them what kind of government they're going to have. And you've had arguments, and they sometimes turn one side and the other, and that's when you have terrible fights and things. But they said their point of view, the providential point of view, was family, state, and church. Godly family, godly state, and godly church. And the distinction and the linkage between the state and church is that they conjoined them. They slightly overlapped all three of these. So that there's a piece in there that they all three are hooked together for a common purpose. They keep their identities, but they're linked together for a common purpose. And it's like law plus grace. Now, we don't talk about it. We believe that grace is substituted for law. And we're not under the law anymore. I hear that all the time, and that's a standard evangelical position too. But the providential say, yeah, we still are under the law. And it's linked with grace. Grace didn't replace it. It fulfilled the piece that's still missing. Because you can't go to heaven on the basis of law. That's not even what law is for, except to show you that you try to keep it and you find out you can't. There's something wrong in our deepest within is a flaw called sin. And we all have that, and when you die, if you still got that flaw in there, you're not going to heaven. God has said, I'm inviting people to come live with me forever, and I'm not bringing sin in here. There is no sin in heaven. I'm not bringing that. So if you still got that, you're not coming in here. So how do you, well, that's getting into the resurrection part of that thing and the belief in that and being born again. It says you must be born again. And that's what happens is that flaw is corrected. It's either removed or corrected so that it fits properly. So God looks at your deepest within when you die. That's the part that still exists. Your body doesn't go, but this part does. And you go, this is one of us. Bring him on into heaven. If he's still got that sin in there, he's not coming in. And that was like I say, it was law plus grace, justice plus mercy. And they said, we need both of them, and we got both of them. They already established. We need to set up our whole system on this basis of these three institutions, and that's the key feature of providentialism, that God set all that up. We didn't make that up. He set it up. And he has a plan for our lives. And another verse that they mention comes out of the book of Acts, 17:26, and it says, from one man, God made all the nations of men on the earth. And he established the times for them, or set the times for them, and he set the exact places where they were to be, comma. And he did so that men would seek him. And that last little part is pretty, that's why he did this, set these nations up. And but he set them up. Every nation's ever been and ever is going to be, he set it up when it's going to emerge, and it might be there in rudimentary form, and at a certain point in world history, whoom, that thing comes up and gets big and is very dominant, and then it tells you how long it's going to last too, and it should be down, something else comes up. And where? So the people that were setting up Virginia in England, the providential people, believed that they were in line with God's plan, that they were going to set this, that he was going to set this thing up in North America. And it was going to be the godly place on earth. And they were going to set it up, and he would bless the effort to set it up. And if you miss that part of the whole story about coming over here to make money and all these, and seeking religious freedom, and they were being persecuted in England, there's much of that has got little bits and pieces of truth in it. But if you look at the providential point of view, they said God set this up. He is setting it up. He's called for this, and we have a chance to be part of that. And he's called us meaning the Bible-believing people in England, to go over there and establish this thing. And from there, they would evangelize the whole entire earth. That was the big plan. Now, you talk about a big missionary vision. We send missionary groups to places, and they build a church or school or something, come back, and and they didn't really expect that to change the whole entire country that they were in. I never hear that from almost anybody, that they went there to turn that into a Christian country. They go there to make it possible for the people to go to church. And the idea of that is that they can come to church and hear the salvation message and come forward and ask Jesus into their heart. And these guys, the providential people, said, well, as I mentioned, we can't even do that. You can't choose him unless he chooses you. And all of a sudden, it happens at the same time. He chooses you in such a way, maybe you thought you chose him, but you're his and you know it. From now on, you know it. And so anyway, that's worth keeping in mind, the providential point of view about all these things. And when they came over to the James River, and they went up past, they landed at Cape Henry first, had a church service, a providential type church service, came up exploring, and within 2 weeks they were up at what we now call Jamestown Island. That was a good place to land because they could put the ships right up to the shore. It's 26 feet deep, almost like right there. They could drop a gangplank down and walk ashore. And that meant they could unload cargo and stuff real easily. But more important than that, these were maritime people. They liked ships. That's where safety was. And they wanted to be able to get off of that land, get back in the ship, and get out in the river. That's what they wanted that quick ingress and egress for. And so that made a nice place and left a little contingent to set a fort there. And then in 2 more weeks, they were up at the fall line. And as I said, the instruction said, go 100 miles up the river, the largest river that's trending northwest. Well, that's the James River. Well, they didn't call it that originally, but they named it the James. And go up 100 miles, which is where the fall line is and where Richmond is now, and set your principal seat there. And, well, I'm starting to get into the teaching on this. I said I wasn't going to do that right now, but so let me wrap that particular part up by saying, why in the world did they go 100 miles up? Jamestown's 40 miles. The city of Henricus is about 65 miles or 70 miles upriver. But Richmond's 100 miles, and the instruction said go 100 miles. Well, the big fear they had was from the Spanish Navy. They'd been at war with Spain for about 30 years, and they had peace for only 3 or 4 years by this time. They didn't trust them. They didn't trust them at all, and the Spanish didn't trust the English Protestants, and it never was resolved properly. And they had a big, very elaborate treaty worked out of how the people worked back and forth in the 2 countries. If you're an Englishman, you're in Spain, and you bust a window or something, whose law are you under, English law or under Roman Catholic law? So that's all spelled out. And if you're a Spanish Catholic and you're in England and your wagon runs across somebody's foot and hurts them, whose law are you under there? Is that person under English law or Spanish Catholic law? So all those details were great, elaborate detail. And but the one thing that's left out in that treaty is North and South America. That's not even mentioned. So if you come over here from England, you're not covered by that treaty. You're on your own. And they made a point of letting them know that. So we want you to go over there and represent us, but not officially. You know, so they set this corporation up, and you're going under the corporation. And the purpose of the corporation is propagating a Christian religion. And by that, they meant the providential version of it, the threefold institutions. But if you stop short of where the Spanish won't go up the river, when it starts getting farther you go, the narrower it gets. And these big warships can't turn around real easily. And they don't like getting in little narrow rivers where you can shoot at them from the behind trees and off of the bluff, and they can't shoot back. They can't turn around. They got to come out on the deck to pull these lines and turn it, and you're getting shot at, sniper type fire. So that you get up above where the river gets small enough where the Spanish won't come up there And they figured 100 miles. Spanish are not going up there. And if they do, you can just melt back into the woods, which you would know by that time would just be gone. And so that's why they set that 100-mile thing. And Jamestown doesn't qualify. It's 40 miles. You can sail that Spanish ship right slap up to that 26-foot thing right off and just blast everything, and then the whole trees, buildings, people, just level the place. It's kind of level anyway, but I mean level down everything that is not just ground. I will say one time I was working in the church on Jamestown Island, which faces east and west, and out of the side door, you can look down the James River. It comes with a big curve, and then it comes around behind where we are. So that big curve is sort of southeast looking. It's not straight south, but southeast. And one day, people just showed up at the church. We had to take whoever came through the door, and we would greet them and offer to do a presentation for them. And here comes a contingent of Spanish naval officers. Now that was interesting. I can't remember how I knew that they were Spanish. They may have had something that said Spain on it. I can't remember, but they certainly were naval officers. And they spoke English too. And they were on the way to Washington, and they came by Jamestown first, like a lot of people do, to get familiar with how this place started over here. And then they go up to Washington and see how it is now. Anyway, I determined that they were Spanish, and there's obviously were naval officers. And we talked for a few minutes, and I said, come here, come up here, I want to show you something. So we went up to the side door. The altar and everything is straight east. The entrance is straight west. And there's a side door that looks out over that big curve and looks down river, down that big curve. So they came and they looked out there, and I said, you know, when the English were here and looked out this door and looked down that river, you know what they were worried about? Oh, what? You know, and I said, they had cannons here, and they had Indians that they were periodically having to fight, but where were the cannons pointed? They were all pointed down to this big curve in the river, all of them. They weren't pointed at the Indians. They weren't worried about the Indians. That wasn't their big worry. It was big enough worry, but it wasn't anything. And I said, you know who they were afraid was going to come around that bend down there and come up here? Oh, who? I said, the Spanish Navy. And oh, you should have seen them. Man, they squared their shoulders. And I said, the English were afraid of the Spanish Navy. The English here knew you couldn't possibly defend against that. And so they were proud. Boy, did they puffed up with pride. At one point, Spain caused fear among the English. Doesn't anymore. They knew that, of course. But, and they knew America was the ones you need to worry about anyhow, for comparison purposes. And but I remember that, and boy, they walked out of there with almost floated out of that church. They'll be like, well, okay, they'll remember that one probably. But that's my point there, is that's why they didn't put the capital at Jamestown, because the enemy ships can come right up to and blast it to the ground. And so that's one of the pieces of the story that Jamestown presents, is that they were the first capital of Virginia, and therefore they're the most important. And when they have the anniversaries of Jamestown, the whole world seemed like this, man, it's just wild. Everybody wants to identify with somebody at Jamestown. My family goes back to somebody at Jamestown, and mine goes back farther than yours did, so I'm better than you. And that kind of, and I'm sitting there saying, no, the capital was up Henricus. It was up to be about 100 miles, and Henricus City is about 15 miles, probably. The river varies a little bit from time to time, but it's about 15 to 20 miles below Richmond. That's the first capital. And when the tensions with Spain eased off, which it did a little bit every year, it was obvious they weren't going to invade England, and England wasn't going down invading Spain, and they quit killing each other on the ships and stuff over here in North America and the Atlantic. They said, we don't really need to sail our ships from England all the way up to the capital, Henricus, check in, say, we're here, and we've got cargo for some other place we just passed, so we'll take it down there, and we're going to unload it, and we will load stuff on from them, sail back up to Henricus and declare what you're moving out of this country, and then all the way back down there. That's a time-consuming thing on those big ships to go up, down, and back. Why don't we just move all this customs office and everything down somewhere near the coast, but they can just declare on the way in and declare on the way out. Well, Jamestown was the most logical place because they could just pull right up to the shore, and so the capital was set up down at Jamestown in 1616. So before that, it had been at the city of Henricus, which was built in 1611 to be the capital. And I served on the board of the city of Henricus for a while, and it was amazing how much resistance there was. Well, I was still working at Jamestown too. From Jamestown, I didn't like them building that city. No, because they're getting them out. There's competition. We were it. Everybody knows Jamestown. We're the. And I'm sitting here with these records. No, it says right here, according to them, this capital was up there, and here at Jamestown was later. So our story about saying we were the first capital is not correct. That's another little thing that still has to be corrected, and what Henricus College was designed to correct, that sort of thing. It's almost like an endless list of little small errors, some of which don't really make much difference, but some do, about the nature and character of America. That's the ones we're looking for, the ones that shaped, when we say America was founded a certain way, therefore we have to do certain things. And if you don't have that correct, you're just making up stuff. You might be right, but oftentimes no, it was founded this way. That's why I wish it was founded. So therefore we have to do those things. And we've got plenty of that. Arguments all over about what does the Constitution mean? What's the basis for a Constitution? What's the Declaration of Independence got to do with the Constitution? What's the Constitution got to do with anything anymore? That's a creator-based document, and we don't believe there is a creator, so therefore we don't want to pay attention to the Constitution either. And we are hearing those arguments being made, sometimes not as clear as I just stated it, but it's there, and it's vicious, and it's going to get worse, I think. But I started this college in response to a prayer call anyway, and I've asked the Lord a number of times, why you got me doing this? I didn't even like history to start with, and but I do now, but I didn't then. And it seemed like everything I'm saying out of the record is contradicting the stuff that's going on. People say, no, that's not true. And yeah, it is. You look at it. Look at this yourself. Tell me if I'm misinterpreting this. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Is an overall thing is that we are providential in our theology here because the original college was providential, and so was America all the way through the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. After that, providentialism faded out a little bit and evangelicalism came in. So we're talking about the first 200 and something years of America was providential. So we need to know providentialism to understand that accurately. And we'll talk about some of the rest of this at a later time. Thank you.